Wealth whispers, but new money screams. When private equity tycoon Richard Sterling walked into the flagship location of the Brass Vine, he expected the world to bow at his bespoke leather shoes. Instead, he locked eyes with a quiet woman in a stained apron holding a tray of crystal glasses. He immediately saw a target for his cruelty, a nobody he could casually crush to impress his dinner guests. What Richard didn't know was that the woman he was about to publicly humiliate didn't just pour the wine. She owned the vineyard, the restaurant, and the very building he was standing in. This is a story of pride, prejudice, and $1 billion reality check. The rain fell in sheets across the glittering skyline of Chicago, blurring the neon lights into streaks of watercolor against the glass. Inside the Brass Vine, however, the atmosphere was a masterclass in controlled perfection. The restaurant was the crown jewel of the Harrington Hospitality Group, an empire boasting 42 high-end establishments across 3 continents. Securing a reservation here required either 6 months of patience or the kind of influence that could move mountains. Clara Harrington possessed both, though looking at her tonight, no one would ever guess. At 46, Clara was a self-made titan. She had taken her late father's single, struggling steakhouse in Philadelphia and ruthlessly, yet elegantly, expanded it into a global syndicate worth over $2 billion. But Clara had a rule, a deeply ingrained, non-negotiable philosophy that horrified her corporate board. Once a month, she worked a shift on the floor of one of her restaurants, not as a manager, not as an observant VIP in a corner booth, but as a waitress, a busser, or a host. She believed that the moment a CEO lost the scent of the kitchen, the weight of the tray, or the exhaustion of a double shift, the empire would begin to rot from the inside out. Tonight, she was Claire, wearing a standard-issue black bistro apron, her graying blonde hair pulled into a tight, practical bun. One of the closing servers had a childcare emergency, and Clara had quietly stepped in, waving off the frantic apologies of her general manager, Thomas Ridge. "Just treat me like you would any other server, Thomas," Clara had instructed, tying the apron strings around her waist in the bustling kitchen. "If I drop a plate, dock my tips." Thomas, a seasoned veteran of the hospitality industry who still sweated through his suit whenever Clara was in town, had merely nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, Miss Harrington." At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy mahogany front doors swung open, bringing a gust of cold wind and the unmistakable, suffocating aura of arrogance. Richard Sterling had arrived. Richard was a man who navigated the world as if he owned it, and in many zip codes he practically did. A 55-year-old billionaire who had made his fortune in corporate liquidations, buying struggling companies, firing the staff, stripping the assets and selling the scraps. He was feared in boardrooms and despised in breakrooms. He wore a custom Tom Ford suit that cost more than a compact car, and a heavy Patek Philippe watch that he deliberately exposed by pulling back his cuffs. Beside him was Victoria Blake, a junior partner at his firm, wearing a strained smile and a designer dress, clearly brought along as an audience for Richard's ego. "Reservation for Sterling," Richard barked at the host stand, not bothering to make eye contact with the young woman stationed there. He was busy flicking a drop of rainwater off his lapel. "Ah, yes, Mr. Sterling. Welcome back to the Brass Vine," the hostess said, her customer service smile firmly in place. "We have a wonderful table for you in the main dining room." "I don't sit in the middle of the room like a tourist," Richard interrupted, his voice booming over the low hum of jazz and clinking silverware. "I want the corner booth, the one by the wine cellar. I requested it." "I apologize, sir, but that booth is currently occupied by a party finishing their dessert. We can seat you immediately at a beautiful window table, or if you'd prefer to wait at the bar. Do I look like a man who waits at a bar? Richard leaned forward, invading the young hostess's personal space. Look at me. Do you know who I am? I don't wait. Tell them to box up their cake and leave. From across the dining room, Clara was wiping down a nearby station, a pristine white linen cloth in her hand. Her sharp blue eyes caught the commotion. She watched as Thomas, the general manager, rushed over, practically tripping over his own polished shoes to extinguish the fire. Thomas apologized profusely, offering complimentary champagne, and eventually, Richard begrudgingly accepted a prime table slightly elevated above the main floor, though not without loudly muttering about the plummeting standards of the establishment. Clara tossed her cloth into a bin. She checked her section assignment. Table 12, Richard Sterling's table. Thomas caught her eye from across the room and gave a microscopic shake of his head, a silent plea. Let me give this table to someone else, please. Clara offered Thomas a thin, reassuring smile. She picked up 2 leather-bound menus. She had dealt with men like Richard Sterling in billion-dollar acquisition meetings. They were all the same. They used volume to mask insecurity and cruelty to simulate power. She smoothed her black apron, picked up her tray, and walked into the lion's den. Good evening, Clara said, her voice steady and modulated to the perfect pitch of professional hospitality. Welcome to the Brass Vine. My name is Claire, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some sparkling or still water? Richard didn't look up from his phone. His thumbs were flying across the screen, hammering out an email. Victoria, sitting across from him, offered a tight, apologetic smile. Still water would be fine, thank you. Did I say I wanted water? Richard snapped, finally tossing his phone onto the table. It clattered against the fine crystal. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and subjected Clara to a slow, sweeping visual inspection. His eyes took in her unadorned face, the simple name tag, and the sensible, slip-resistant black shoes she wore. His lip curled into a sneer of visceral disgust. I want a martini, Richard demanded. Grey Goose, extra dry, 3 olives. If I can taste even a hint of vermouth, I'm sending it back, and I'll make sure you pay for it out of your wages. Do you understand, Claire? He said her name slowly, mocking the simplicity of it. Perfectly, sir, Clara replied evenly. She didn't blink. She wrote nothing down, committing the order to memory, a habit from her early days waiting tables in the 90s. And get her something fruity, Richard waved a hand dismissively toward Victoria. Now bring the wine list, the reserve list, not the laminated garbage you hand out to the tourists who save up all year to eat here. Right away, sir. When Clara returned with the drinks and the leather-bound reserve wine ledger, Richard was already holding court, boasting loudly to Victoria about a manufacturing plant in Ohio he had just shut down. 3,000 jobs gone, Richard laughed, taking his martini glass from Clara's tray without a word of thanks. The union rep was literally crying in my office. I told him, tears don't increase profit margins, buddy. You should have seen his face. Victoria gave a hollow laugh, her eyes darting nervously toward Clara, but Clara remained an unreadable statue. Richard opened the heavy wine ledger, flipping through the pages with aggressive, dismissive flicks of his wrist. Let's see what passes for a decent vintage in this overpriced cafeteria, he muttered. He stopped on a page dedicated to rare Bordeaux. Here, the Chateau Haut-Brion, 1989. Bring it, and don't drop it. It costs more than you make in a decade. Clara recognized the bottle immediately. She should. She had personally negotiated the purchase of the entire case at an auction in Geneva 3 years prior. It was a magnificent wine, complex and earthy, priced at $4,500 on the menu. "An excellent choice, sir," Clara said politely. "I will have the sommelier retrieve it from the cellar." "No," Richard barked. "I don't want some pretentious guy in a cheap suit lecturing me about soil content. You bring it, you open it, and you better do it right." "Certainly." 10 minutes later, Clara returned. She carried the dusty, precious bottle in a cradle, treating it with the reverence it deserved. She presented the label to Richard. He barely glanced at it, waving his hand for her to open it. With practiced, surgical precision, Clara used her wine key to remove the foil and extract the fragile, decades-old cork. It slid out flawlessly, intact. She poured a small tasting amount into Richard's glass. Richard picked up the glass. He didn't swirl it. He didn't smell it. He took a gulp, swished it around his mouth like mouthwash, and swallowed heavily. Then he slammed the glass down on the table so hard the stem cracked. "It's corked," he announced loudly. Clara looked at the bottle, then at the intact cork resting on the silver saucer. "Sir, I assure you, the cork was in perfect condition, and the storage of this vintage is climate monitored. It has not turned." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The ambient noise in the restaurant began to quiet down as other diners turned to look at the commotion. "Are you calling me a liar?" Richard stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his physical size to try and intimidate Clara, stepping dangerously close to her. "You are a waitress in cheap, ugly shoes. You probably go home and drink fermented grape juice out of a cardboard box. Do not stand there and tell me, a man who owns a private wine cellar worth more than your life, that I don't know when a wine is corked." "I am merely stating a fact about the bottle, sir," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly calm, a stark contrast to his escalating rage. Her composure seemed to infuriate him further. Men like Richard fed on fear, denied it, they starved, and then they panicked. "You're an idiot," Richard snarled. To prove his point, he aggressively grabbed the bottle from the cradle. In doing so, his cuff caught the edge of the crystal wine glass. It tipped over, spilling the deep red liquid directly onto Clara's apron, staining the white fabric beneath, and splashing onto Richard's bespoke leather shoes. "Look what you did," Richard roared, pointing at his shoes. "You clumsy, incompetent fool. These are Baluti. You just ruined a $4,000 pair of shoes." Victoria gasped, sinking lower in her chair. "Richard, please, it was an accident." "Shut up, Victoria," Richard snapped, never taking his furious eyes off Clara. "Where is the manager? I want the manager right now. You're done. You are finished in this town." Thomas had already been hovering near the perimeter, drawn by the shattered glass and the rising volume of Richard's tirade. He practically sprinted the last few steps, a fresh white towel in his hand. "Mr. Sterling, please, my deepest apologies," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly. He dropped to one knee and actually began attempting to blot the wine off Richard's shoe. Clara stood perfectly still, looking down at her general manager, kneeling at the feet of this tyrant. Something cold and steely clicked into place behind her ribcage. The undercover exercise was over. "Get off the floor, Thomas," Richard spat, pulling his foot away. "Your idiot waitress just destroyed my property. I want her fired, right here, right now. I want to watch her cry as you take her name tag." Thomas stood up, his face pale. He looked at Clara. He knew exactly who she was. The woman standing before him in the stained apron wasn't just his boss. She was the woman who had personally paid for his daughter's leukemia treatments 3 years ago when his insurance fell short. He would rather throw himself into the Chicago River than fire Clara Harrington. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas began, choosing his words with agonizing care. I am terribly sorry for the disruption. We will, of course, cover the cost of cleaning your shoes, and your meal tonight will be entirely complimentary. However, I cannot terminate this employee." Richard blinked, genuinely stunned that his demand hadn't been immediately met. The veins in his neck began to bulge. "You cannot, or you will not. Do you know who I am? I am Richard Sterling. My private equity firm is evaluating the acquisition of 3 commercial properties on this very block. I know the board members of Harrington Hospitality. I golf with Arthur Vance." Clara, who had been silently wiping her hands on a dry corner of her apron, finally spoke. "Arthur Vance hasn't been on the board for 2 years, Mr. Sterling," Clara said mildly. "He was asked to step down following a rather embarrassing SEC inquiry regarding insider trading, a matter he settled out of court." Richard froze. He stared at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "How the hell does a waitress know about Arthur Vance?" "I know a lot of things," Clara said. She reached behind her back and calmly untied the strings of her apron. "I know, for instance, that your firm, Sterling Capital, recently leveraged itself up to the eyeballs to acquire that Ohio manufacturing plant you were bragging about. I also know that because you stripped the union contracts, you are facing a massive class action lawsuit that is currently terrifying your primary investors." Victoria let out a small, strangled squeak, looking back and forth between Richard and the waitress. Richard's face went slack. The bravado faltered for a fraction of a second before roaring back to life, fueled by pure indignation. "How dare you speak to me about my business? You're serving me food, Thomas!" He turned his wrath back to the manager. "If you don't fire her this second, I will personally call the CEO of this company. I will have this entire restaurant shut down for health code violations. I will bury you both." "You're certainly welcome to try, Richard," Clara said. She pulled the stained apron over her head and handed it to Thomas, who took it reverently. Underneath, she wore a simple, beautifully tailored black silk blouse and perfectly cut trousers. She unclipped the plastic name tag that read Claire and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a soft clack right next to the shattered wine glass. "But I think you might find it difficult to get the CEO on the phone," Clara continued, stepping out from behind the table and standing squarely in front of him. She wasn't a tall woman, but at that moment she seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. The quiet, submissive posture of the server was gone, replaced by the rigid, commanding spine of a corporate titan. "And why is that?" Richard sneered, though a bead of sweat had suddenly materialized on his temple. Clara offered him a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. It was a shark's smile. "Because," Clara said softly, her voice carrying effortlessly across the dead-silent dining room, "I'm not carrying my phone at the moment." The silence in the dining room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that usually precedes a car crash, a sudden vacuum of sound where even the clinking of silver against china had abruptly ceased. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his hand still hovering halfway between his ruined Baluti shoes and the shattered crystal on the table. He stared at the woman before him. Gone was the subservient posture, the lowered gaze, the invisible aura of the service industry worker he had so easily dismissed. In her place stood a woman whose posture radiated absolute authority. Victoria Blake was the first to connect the dots. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath her expensive cosmetics. As a junior partner at Sterling Capital, it was her job to know the faces of the apex predators in their financial ecosystem. She had spent the last 3 weeks compiling dossiers on the major players in Chicago's commercial real estate market. "Richard," Victoria whispered, her voice barely carrying over the smooth jazz playing from the overhead speakers. She reached out and tugged frantically at the sleeve of his Tom Ford suit. "Richard, stop! Look at her!" "I am looking at her!" Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. He shook Victoria's hand off. "She's an insubordinate waitress who is about to be sued for destruction of property." "No, Richard," Victoria hissed, her eyes wide with mounting terror as she looked from the discarded name tag that read Claire to the sharp, unyielding blue eyes of the woman standing over them. "That's not Claire. That's Clara. Clara Harrington." The name hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Richard's brain, usually so adept at calculating risk and reward, seemed to misfire. He looked at Clara, then down at the apron Thomas Ridge was holding like a sacred relic, and back to Clara's tailored silk blouse. "Don't be ridiculous," Richard scoffed, though a tremor had finally entered his voice. He forced a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Clara Harrington operates out of Manhattan. She's a billionaire. She doesn't pour wine in a local bistro." "I split my time, Richard," Clara said smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. True power never has to shout. "But my primary residence is, and always has been, right here in Chicago. And the Brass Vine isn't just a local bistro. It was my father's first successful venture. It is the cornerstone of my entire syndicate. I own the restaurant. I own the name. And as of last Tuesday, I personally bought the freehold of this entire historic building." Richard took a step back, his legs suddenly unsteady. The flush of angry red that had colored his face was rapidly retreating, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. You were serving my table." "I work one floor shift a month across my properties," Clara explained, her tone conversational, almost academic. "It keeps me grounded. It allows me to see how my staff is treated. And more importantly, it allows me to see the true character of the people who dine in my establishments. Wealth is an excellent mask, Richard, but arrogance always makes the mask slip." She pulled out the heavy oak chair opposite Victoria and sat down without asking permission. It was a calculated move. She was no longer standing at attention. She was taking over his table. She gestured to Thomas, who immediately stepped forward and discreetly swept the broken glass and the spilled wine into a silver dustpan, moving with the efficiency of a ghost. "Now let's talk about those 3 commercial properties on this block," Clara said, resting her elbows on the table and steepling her fingers. "The ones you mentioned you were evaluating for acquisition?" Richard swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, panicked calculation of a man trapped in a corner. "Miss Harrington, Clara, listen, this was all a terrible misunderstanding. The lighting in here, the stress of the day. I've been dealing with a massive corporate restructuring, and I took my frustration out in the wrong venue. I apologize." "An apology requires remorse, Richard. You're only sorry because you realized the boot you were trying to lick is attached to the neck you were trying to step on," Clara replied coldly. Victoria sank lower in her chair, wishing the floorboards would simply open up and swallow her whole. "Those properties," Clara continued, ignoring his stuttering defense. "Your firm, Sterling Capital, desperately needs them. You've over-leveraged your latest fund on that Ohio manufacturing plant debacle. Your investors are terrified of the impending class action lawsuit. You need to bundle those 3 prime real estate locations into a REIT, a real estate investment trust, to create the illusion of liquidity and stable passive income before your quarterly earnings call next Friday. Am I correct?" Richard stared at her, horrified. How could you possibly know the internal strategy of my firm?" "Because," Clara smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. My acquisitions team was the one who drove the price of that Ohio plant up during the bidding war, knowing you would foolishly overpay just to beat me. And because I know how desperate you are, I also know that if you don't secure these 3 buildings on this block, Sterling Capital is going to face a liquidity crisis that will trigger a massive sell-off. We have the capital, Richard lied weakly, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. We're submitting the final paperwork to the seller's broker tomorrow morning. It's a done deal. It really isn't, Clara sighed, leaning back in her chair. She looked over her shoulder. Thomas, would you mind bringing me a glass of the reserve Pinot? All this talking is making me quite parched. Right away, Miss Harrington, Thomas said, offering a crisp nod before vanishing toward the bar. Clara turned her attention back to the broken billionaire. You can't submit the paperwork to the seller's broker tomorrow, Richard, because the seller no longer owns the properties. The silence returned, ringing in Richard's ears. I bought them, Clara stated simply, through my subsidiary Apex Holdings. We closed the deal at 4 p.m. this afternoon. Cash waived the inspection period. Richard looked like he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. If Harrington Hospitality owned those buildings, his firm's lifeline was entirely in the hands of the woman whose shoes he had just demanded be stripped from her feet. You, Richard stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if looking for a hidden camera. You own the properties? Then we can negotiate. We can make a deal. Sterling Capital is prepared to offer 20% over market value. You can flip them to me right now and make an instant profit. It's good business, Thomas returned, placing a pristine crystal glass of Pinot Noir in front of Clara. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the tension stretch until it was nearly unbearable. It would be good business, Clara agreed softly. But I have a personal policy, Richard. I don't do business with men who make my staff cry. I don't do business with men who destroy livelihoods for sport. And I absolutely do not do business with men who cannot distinguish between a corked bottle of 1989 Haut-Brion and their own sour palate. The air conditioning in the Brass Vine was set to a comfortable 70 degrees, but Richard Sterling was sweating as if he were standing in the middle of a blast furnace. Clara, please. Let's be reasonable, Richard pleaded. The sneering tyrant was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow shell of a man. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. If I don't secure those properties, the board will vote me out. I'll lose the firm. Everything I've built. Everything you've built by tearing others down, Clara corrected him smoothly. She didn't recoil from his hand. She merely looked at it with mild distaste until he slowly pulled it back. You stood in the middle of my dining room and bragged about putting 3,000 people out of work in Ohio. You laughed about a union representative crying in your office. You demanded my general manager fire a woman you believed to be a struggling waitress, simply to satisfy a momentary spike of your own ego. I was out of line. I was stressed. You were yourself, Clara interrupted, her voice hardening, losing the conversational edge and ringing with the full, intimidating weight of a CEO who commanded thousands. Character is not what you do when you are in a boardroom surrounded by your peers. Character is how you treat the people who you believe can do nothing for you. You looked at me in that apron and saw something subhuman, something you could break. Victoria Blake, who had been completely silent, finally spoke. Ms. Harrington, please understand, this does not reflect the values of the junior partners at Sterling Capital. Richard whipped his head around to glare at his date. Betrayed. Victoria, shut your mouth! No, Richard, you shut yours. Victoria fired back, her survival instincts overriding her fear of her boss. She stood up, smoothing her designer dress. She looked at Clara with genuine respect. "Miss Harrington, it has been an illuminating evening. I will be submitting my resignation to Sterling Capital tomorrow morning. I'd rather take my chances in a volatile market than sink with this ship." Clara offered Victoria a small, genuine smile. "A wise decision, Miss Blake. When you've cleared your desk, send your resume to Harrington Hospitality's corporate office. We are always looking for sharp analysts who know when to cut their losses." Victoria nodded deeply, picked up her clutch, and walked away from the table without a backward glance. Richard watched her go, his jaw slack. He was completely isolated. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted, crushed him, and ground him into dust. "Now," Clara said, tapping her fingernail against her wine glass, "we have the matter of the bill to settle." "The bill?" Richard echoed blankly. "Yes, Thomas offered to comp your meal, but as I recall, you explicitly demanded a bottle of the 1989 Chateau Haut-Briand. You opened it, you drank it, and then, in a fit of temper, you poured it over my floor. The bottle was perfectly fine, which means you purchased it." Clara raised her hand, a subtle gesture that brought Thomas Ridge to the table instantly. He carried a sleek, black leather checkbook. "Thomas, the check, please," Clara said. Thomas placed the leather book in front of Richard. The total was printed clearly at the bottom, $4,585, including tax. Richard stared at the number. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was the sheer, inescapable humiliation of paying it. He reached into his breast pocket with shaking hands, pulled out a heavy black American Express card, and threw it onto the table. "Take it," Richard muttered, looking down at his lap. "I'll run this right away, sir," Thomas said, his voice entirely devoid of the trembling fear it had held just 30 minutes prior. He took the card and walked toward the POS system. Clara stood up. The confrontation was over. She had extracted her pound of flesh, not with screaming or security guards, but with absolute surgical precision. "You have ruined me," Richard whispered to the empty chair across from him. "No, Richard," Clara said, looking down at him. "You ruined yourself. I merely provided the mirror. Sterling Capital is not getting those properties. You will face your board next week, and you will have to explain why you failed. I suggest you start drafting your severance demands." Thomas returned with the receipt and a pen. Richard signed it mechanically, grabbing his copy and shoving it into his pocket. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas said politely, gesturing toward the main entrance, "I believe it is time for you to leave." Richard stood up. He felt the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. The wealthy elite of Chicago, bankers, judges, tech moguls, people he desperately needed to impress, were all watching. They had seen him yell at a waitress, and they had seen Clara Harrington sit at his table and verbally dismantle him. At a nearby table, Harrison Caldwell, a rival hedge fund manager Richard had been feuding with for years, raised a glass of scotch in a mocking toast as Richard met his eye. Richard flushed a deep, agonizing red. He turned and walked toward the exit. With every step he took, his ruined $4,000 Berluti shoes squeaked against the polished hardwood floor, a sticky, pathetic sound caused by the spilled vintage wine. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound echoed in the quiet restaurant, a final, lingering punchline to his monumental arrogance. He pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and disappeared into the rainy Chicago night, a man who had walked in expecting to buy the world, only to realize he could no longer afford the rent. Inside, the tension in the room snapped. A low murmur of conversation resumed, buzzing with gossip and shock. Clara watched the doors close. She let out a long, quiet breath, rolling her shoulders to release the tension. Thomas approached her, a look of profound awe and gratitude on his face. "Miss Harrington," Thomas started, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you." Clara smiled warmly, patting Thomas on the shoulder. "You have nothing to thank me for, Thomas. You protected your staff. You did exactly what a good manager should do. Although," she looked down at the floor, "I am incredibly sorry about the mess." "Don't worry about the floor, Ma'am. We'll have it spotless in 5 minutes," Thomas assured her. "Would you like me to have your driver bring the car around? It's been a long evening." Clara shook her head. She looked toward the kitchen, where the rest of the staff was peeking through the porthole windows, wide-eyed. "No, Thomas," Clara said, reaching for the stained black apron he had draped over a nearby chair. She tied the strings expertly around her waist, covering her silk blouse once more. "My shift doesn't end until 11. Table 8 needs their dessert menus, and I believe Table 14 is ready for their check." Thomas stared at her, dumbfounded. You're going back to work?" "An empire doesn't run itself, Thomas," Clara Harrington said, picking up her tray, "and I never leave a job half-finished." The morning sun over Lake Michigan offered no warmth, casting a cold, unforgiving light against the steel and glass canyons of LaSalle Street. Inside the sprawling, minimalist offices of Sterling Capital, the atmosphere was suffocating. It was 7:30 a.m. on a Thursday, but the trading floor felt like a morgue. Richard Sterling sat in his corner office overlooking the Chicago River, his custom-tailored suit looking less like armor and more like a shroud. The espresso on his desk had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sickening squeak of his wine-soaked Baluti shoes echoing across the dining room of the Brass Vine, followed by the phantom laughter of his peers. But the social humiliation was merely the appetizer. The financial reality was the main course, and it was being served cold. The door to his office swung open without a knock. Gregory Cole, his chief financial officer, walked in. Gregory looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. In his hand was a sheaf of papers that trembled slightly. "Tell me you have a lifeline, Greg," Richard said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Tell me you reached the broker for the properties. Tell me there's a loophole in the Apex Holdings contract." Gregory slowly shook his head, dropping the papers onto Richard's desk. "There is no loophole, Richard. The ink is dry. Clara Harrington paid 20% over asking price in pure cash. The title transferred at 4 p.m. yesterday. But that's not why I'm here." Richard frowned, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "What do you mean? Did you really think a woman who controls a $2 billion hospitality empire was just going to buy 3 buildings to spite you?" Gregory asked, his tone dripping with an insubordination he would never have dared exhibit 24 hours ago. "She didn't just play defense, Richard. She went on the offensive. And she went for the throat." Gregory pointed a shaking finger at the top document. "At 6 a.m. this morning, I received a notification from our primary mezzanine lenders. You know, the consortium that backed our leveraged buyout of the Ohio manufacturing plant, the debt we've been struggling to service because of the class action lawsuits." "I know the debt, Greg," Richard snapped, a spike of his old temper flaring. "What about it?" "They sold it," Gregory whispered. "The lenders bundled our corporate debt and sold it off-market at a slight discount to a private equity vehicle." Richard's blood ran cold. The pieces were clicking together, forming a picture of absolute devastation. "Who bought it?" "Apex Holdings," Gregory replied. "Clara Harrington's subsidiary." "Richard, She doesn't just own the buildings we needed to save our quarterly earnings. She now owns our senior debt. She is our primary creditor. And because we missed the covenant threshold last month, which the previous lenders were giving us a grace period on, she has the legal right to call the loan in full. Today, Richard slumped back in his ergonomic leather chair, all the air leaving his lungs. A margin call. It was a death sentence. Sterling Capital didn't have the liquidity to pay off the Ohio debt in full. If Clara called the loan, the firm would be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of the week. She engineered a hostile takeover, Richard muttered, staring blankly at the wall. Over a spilled glass of wine. No. A cool, unfamiliar voice echoed from the doorway. Richard and Gregory both turned. Standing in the doorway of the CEO's office was Victoria Blake. She was dressed impeccably in a sharp navy suit, holding a simple cardboard box containing her personal desk items. She didn't engineer a hostile takeover over a spilled glass of wine, Richard, Victoria said calmly, stepping fully into the room. She did it because you showed her exactly how careless you are with your assets. You treat people like collateral damage, which means you treat companies the same way. She saw a vulnerability, and she capitalized on it. That's just good business. You. Richard stood up, his face flushing with impotent rage. You are in breach of your non-disclosure agreement. I'll have you disbarred. I'll have you blacklisted from every firm on Wall Street. Actually, my NDA covers proprietary financial models and client lists, Victoria corrected him, adjusting her grip on her box. It does not cover me resigning due to a toxic work environment and a catastrophic failure of leadership. I sent my formal resignation to HR an hour ago. And I suggest you check your email, Richard. Word moves fast in the loop. Richard scrambled for his mouse, waking up his computer monitors. His inbox was flooded. There were urgent meeting requests from the board of directors, flagged emails from major institutional investors like Vanguard and BlackRock demanding immediate risk assessments, and a Google alert for his own name. The Wall Street Journal had already published an online exclusive. Sterling Capital nears collapse as Harrington Hospitality quietly acquires distressed debt. Clara Harrington had tipped off the press. She was bleeding him out in the public square. "Where are you going?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking as he looked back at Victoria. "Who is going to hire a junior partner from a collapsed firm?" Victoria offered him a small, almost pitying smile. "I had an interview at 6:30 this morning over coffee. I'm moving to the corporate acquisitions team at Harrington Hospitality Group. It turns out Ms. Harrington values analysts who know when to cut their losses. Goodbye, Richard. Good luck with the board." As Victoria walked out, leaving the door wide open, Gregory Cole slowly backed away from the desk. "Greg," Richard pleaded, the anger totally replaced by panic. "Greg, we have to draft a restructuring plan. We have to call the creditors." "I resign, Richard," Gregory said softly, turning his back. "I'm going to go clear out my desk before the SEC locks down the building." Richard Sterling was left entirely alone in his corner office, surrounded by the physical manifestations of his wealth, realizing for the first time in his life that he had absolutely nothing of value. 6 days later, the relentless, punishing rain that had mirrored Richard Sterling's descent into professional ruin finally cleared, leaving Chicago bathed in a crisp, bright, and deeply indifferent autumn sunlight. The corporate headquarters of Harrington Hospitality Group did not loom over the city like the aggressive glass and steel monoliths favored by Sterling Capital. Instead, it occupied the top 4 floors of a meticulously restored, historic Art Deco skyscraper in the heart of the Gold Coast. It was a building that whispered of old money, quiet power, and unshakable foundations. Richard Sterling stepped out of the back of his town car, feeling the crisp wind off Lake Michigan bite through his overcoat. He looked up at the brass detailing above the entrance, his stomach churning with a nauseating blend of dread and disbelief. He was accompanied by his two remaining corporate attorneys, Harrison and Cole, both of whom walked with the stiff, condemned posture of men who knew they were marching to their own executions. Richard himself looked entirely hollowed out. The aggressive swagger that had defined his 55 years on Earth was completely gone. The arrogant sneer had been surgically removed by sleepless nights, replaced by the exhausted, sunken eyes of a man who had spent a week watching his life's work evaporate into thin air. The private elevator ride to the executive floor was agonizingly silent. Every tick of the ascending floor indicator felt like a hammer striking the nails into his coffin. When the doors finally parted, Richard stepped onto thick, sound-absorbing carpeting. Unlike the sterile, cold modernism of his own trading floors, Clara's headquarters felt like an extension of her world-class restaurants. Rich, dark mahogany paneling, warm, ambient lighting, and an atmosphere of quiet, terrifyingly efficient excellence. A receptionist with a perfectly neutral expression led the trio down a wide corridor lined with modern art, finally stopping before a set of heavy, double oak doors. She pushed them open, revealing a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the vast blue expanse of the lake beyond. Sitting at the head of a massive, custom-built conference table carved from a single slab of walnut was Clara Harrington. She wore a tailored charcoal grey suit that radiated authority, her hands neatly folded in front of her. To her immediate right sat her chief legal counsel, a formidable-looking man surrounded by pristine stacks of paper, and to her left, meticulously reviewing a digital tablet with serene focus, sat Victoria Blake. Richard flinched visibly at the sight of his former junior partner sitting at the right hand of his executioner. Just a week ago, he had ordered Victoria to shut up while he berated a waitress. Now she was wearing a bespoke navy blazer, looking more composed and powerful than he ever had. He wanted to shout, to demand she leave the room, but the words died in his dry throat. He simply couldn't afford the luxury of anger anymore. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, echoing the exact polite tone she had used when offering him sparkling or still water at table 12. "Please have a seat. Gentlemen." Richard and his lawyers sank into the plush leather chairs opposite Clara. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy, but it wasn't chaotic. It was the crushing silence of a predetermined outcome. "I won't waste your time, Richard, as I know your schedule is currently quite volatile," Clara began, her sharp blue eyes locking onto his. She slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished wood table. It glided with a soft hiss and stopped precisely in front of him. "Inside this folder are the terms of the debt restructuring," Clara explained, leaning back in her chair. "Apex Holdings is willing to forgive the immediate call on the Ohio manufacturing debt. This action, and this action alone, will save Sterling Capital from declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy when the markets open tomorrow morning." Richard's lead attorney, Harrison, cautiously opened the folder, his eyes scanning the dense, tightly packed legal text. Within seconds, the blood drained from Harrison's face. He looked up, his professional detachment shattering. "Ms. Harrington, these terms are draconian," Harrison stammered. "You are demanding a complete, irrevocable transfer of all voting rights. You're completely stripping the executive board of its autonomy." "I am demanding a controlling 72% equity stake in Sterling Capital," Clara corrected smoothly, not breaking eye contact with Richard. "Furthermore, the current chief executive officer, Mr. Sterling, will step down immediately upon signing. He will forfeit his golden parachute entirely. His remaining equity will be immediately diluted to Class B non-voting shares. In exchange for these concessions, Harrington Hospitality will inject just enough capital to keep the firm solvent, and we will begin quietly liquidating your distressed assets to pay off your terrified investors. "You're stealing my company," Richard whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the grain of the wooden table. "You're taking absolutely everything I built. I am buying your severely mismanaged debt at a premium to save thousands of jobs that you recklessly jeopardized for a quick payout," Clara countered, her voice dropping a few degrees, the corporate chill hardening into solid ice. "That Ohio manufacturing plant you bragged about gutting? We are retrofitting it. We are honoring the union contracts you illegally tore up, and we are converting the facility into the primary logistics and supply hub for all 42 Harrington Hospitality properties in North America. We are saving those 3,000 jobs, Richard. The only job being lost today is yours." "I won't sign it," Richard said stubbornly. He looked up, trying to summon the ghost of the ruthless predator he used to be. "I'll take it to court. I'll tie you up in litigation for years. I know judges in this city." Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The polite corporate mask slipped just a fraction, revealing the ruthless, street-smart survivor who had built a global empire out of a single, grease-stained kitchen in Philadelphia. "If you do not sign that document in the next 5 minutes," Clara said softly, the quiet volume of her voice making the threat infinitely more terrifying, "I will officially call the loan at 5 p.m. today. Sterling Capital will default. Your firm will go bankrupt by tomorrow morning. Your institutional investors will lose everything, and the subsequent aggressive SEC investigations into your over-leveraged funds will easily uncover the gross negligence your firm has been hiding." She let the devastating reality of her words hang in the air, watching him process his own destruction. "You won't just lose your firm, Richard," Clara continued, her tone almost conversational. "You will lose your penthouse. You will lose your cars. You will face criminal charges, and you will lose your freedom. You will be utterly, completely, and publicly ruined." Richard looked frantically to his left, then to his right. He looked at his highly paid lawyers, desperate for a loophole, a counter-strategy, a shred of hope. Harrison and Cole offered no defense. They simply looked down at their legal pads, a silent, damning confirmation that Richard had absolutely no leverage left in the universe. "Or," Clara said, softening her tone just a fraction to offer the illusion of mercy, "you can pick up that pen. You sign the paper. You walk away with your non-voting shares, which, once I fix your company, will still provide you with a modest, quiet dividend. You walk away with your personal bank accounts intact. You fade into comfortable obscurity. It's a far better deal than the one you gave the people whose livelihoods you destroyed for sport." Richard's breathing was shallow and ragged. He reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the heavy Montblanc pen resting beside the folder. He flipped to the signature page. He hesitated for one long, agonizing second, the ghost of his former pride fighting a desperate, losing battle against his basic instinct for survival. He pressed the nib to the paper. He signed his name. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. It felt as though he had just pushed away his entire identity, leaving behind an empty vessel. "Done!" Richard rasped, his throat tight. He stood up slowly, his joints suddenly feeling ancient. He avoided eye contact with everyone in the room, looking smaller, diminished, a king entirely stripped of his court. "Are we finished?" Clara placed her hand flat on the leather folder. She looked at Victoria, who offered a small, curt, and highly professional nod of confirmation. "We are," Clara said, As Richard turned and began the long, humiliating walk toward the heavy oak doors, Clara's voice stopped him one last time. "Richard." He paused, his hand gripping the cool brass doorknob. He didn't turn around. He couldn't bear to look at her. "For what it's worth," Clara said, her voice dropping the corporate chill entirely, replacing it with a strange, profound sincerity that echoed in the quiet room. The 1989 Chateau Haut-Brion truly wasn't corked. It is an exquisite, flawlessly balanced vintage. You just didn't know how to appreciate what was poured for you. Richard closed his eyes. He didn't answer. He simply pushed the door open and walked out into the hallway, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, fading away until he was gone entirely, a ghost haunting his own legacy. Clara watched the door click shut. She let out a long, quiet breath, the immense tension of the multi-million-dollar hostile takeover finally bleeding out of her shoulders. She turned to her left. "Excellent work on the valuation models, Victoria," Clara said warmly, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "You found the exact pressure points in his portfolio." "Thank you, Miss Harrington," Victoria replied, closing her tablet. She looked toward the door Richard had just exited, a profound sense of vindication in her eyes. It was immensely satisfying work. "I imagine it was," Clara chuckled, standing up and smoothing the front of her tailored suit. She glanced at the heavy Patek Philippe wall clock ticking softly in the corner of the boardroom. It was 3:45 p.m. "Well," Clara said, picking up her sleek leather briefcase from the floor, "the transition team will handle the filings with the SEC in the morning. I leave the drafting of the press release in your extremely capable hands, Victoria." "Of course," Victoria said, organizing her digital files. "Are you heading home for the evening, Miss Harrington? It's been a monumental week. You must be exhausted." Clara stopped at the boardroom door. A slow, deeply familiar smile touched the corners of her mouth, lighting up her sharp blue eyes with a lively, grounded energy. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a neatly folded, standard-issue black bistro apron. "No," Clara Harrington said, her voice light and full of purpose. "It's the third Thursday of the month. I have a dinner shift at the flagship in 20 minutes, and I hear Table 14 is celebrating an anniversary tonight." The story of Clara Harrington and Richard Sterling serves as a stark reminder that true power does not need to shout, and arrogance is often a mask for profound vulnerability. In a world obsessed with status symbols and corporate dominance, the most dangerous mistake one can make is confusing a person's current role with their inherent worth. Richard Sterling believed his wealth gave him a permanent lease on cruelty, assuming the woman in the apron was a minor character in his grand narrative. Instead, he discovered that character is revealed not in how we treat our equals, but in how we treat those we believe are beneath us. Wealth can buy buildings, leverage debt, and command fear, but it cannot purchase class or basic human decency. Ultimately, respect remains the only currency that never depreciates, and the highest seats of power are often built by those who never forget how to sweep the floor.